Part 3. Directions. In this part, you will hear 3 talks or lectures. The talks or lectures will not be repeated. There are 5 questions for each talk or lecture. For each question, choose the right answer, A, B, C, or D. Then on the answer sheet, find the number of the question and fill in the space that corresponds to the letter of the answer you have chosen. Questions 21 to 25.
Listen to part of a discussion in a business class.
First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 25.
Industry analysts report that multinational food companies are trying to use the same types of strategies that automobile and electronics manufacturers have found to be successful in the global marketplace. The problem is that general rules for products that tend to be traditional for national or even regional tastes, these products are very difficult to identify, and sales aren't easy to project. But the companies that tend to do best are those that are the most responsive to local tastes. And they spend development dollars on taste testing in the local markets before they formulate the final product. Can anyone recall any examples from the case studies in the text? Sandy?
McDonald's Big Mac has more mustard in the special sauce in Paris than it does in New York.
Because?
Because taste tests verified that people in the United States liked sweeter condiments than people did in France. In fact, I think the sugar content for export foods in general usually has to be modified when American products are taste tested overseas.
Right you are. Probably the company that's adapted most to local tastes is Nestle. Can you believe that they produce more than 200 slightly different blends of Nescafé for export to different countries? Amazing, but true. But sometimes taste is less a problem of ingredients and more a matter of the way a food product looks or feels. One case study that comes to mind is the one about the soft cookies that just don't sell as well in England as crisp cookies. So you can see that taste extends way beyond just flavor. It's really a combination of flavor preferences and local expectations. Look, here's another example of accommodation that had more to do with the expectation for a process than the flavor of the product. In this case study, it was cake. Remember when Betty Crocker cake mixes were introduced in England, they weren't accepted because the English homemaker felt more comfortable with convenience foods that required more than water to prepare them. Go figure. But that was the problem uncovered by extensive market research. So when the mix was reformulated without an egg, and the preparation included adding an egg with the water before mixing it, well, Betty Crocker cake mixes became very popular in England. Any other examples come to mind? They don't have to be from the case studies in the book.
How about serving sizes?
Go on.
Well, soft drinks for one. Just compare the serving sizes in the United States and many foreign markets where soft drinks are sold. The cans in foreign markets are much smaller because consumers expect it. But in the United States, well, supersizing is probably a consideration when a foreign company is trying to crack the American market.
That's a great example. So the taste can be acceptable, but the packaging has to compare favorably with the competing brands and the public's expectations.
Yeah, but that makes products more expensive, doesn't it? I mean, because you can't standardize the product or the packaging, so that would make it more costly to produce, wouldn't it?
Right you are, Chris. In fact, you've really gone to the heart of the issue. A compromise has to occur between the requirement that products be adapted to please the taste and the expectations of local consumers and the pressure to standardize products for maximum cost effectiveness. Now, let's complicate that even further. Even the experts don't agree on the importance of how far to go in adapting products for local markets. A few years ago, Ted Levitt, He's the editor of the Harvard Business Review. Levitt predicted what he called a pluralization of consumption. What he means is that, at least in some areas, tastes are likely to converge, which makes sense when you think about the increased opportunities for travel and sampling of foods, as well as the continued global marketing efforts by multinational corporations. So, logically, it's smarter to simply identify the areas in which tastes are most likely to be the same and concentrate efforts on those food products. But there's also the issue of global marketing. How about the potential to create taste? I mean, selling the image that surrounds using a product. If consumers want to associate themselves with that image, won't they develop a taste for the product that does that for them? For example, there's some evidence that the popularity of products seen in movies and television spills into the foreign marketplace. This subtle brand association with the movie or the celebrities in it translates into high-dollar deals for certain brands to be visibly displayed in widely distributed films.
Oh, right. I was reading about that. It was in a couple of the case studies. The bottle, a can, or a package appears as part of the character's persona. And if it's a character that audiences choose to identify with, then the taste for the product may follow, or at least that's what the marketing experts are betting on.
And that includes foreign audiences. Anyone drink Starbucks coffee? Well, Starbucks began as a regional coffee in Seattle, Washington, and made the global leap in 2000, opening shops in China, a huge market, surely, but also a traditionally tea-drinking society. So what's the attraction? Starbucks is marketing to the cosmopolitan consumer, the young trendy set looking for a modern image as well as a different taste. Still, there have been some real surprises in the multinational dinner party. No one has really figured out why the Italians, Germans, and British love Kraft's Philadelphia cream cheese, and the Greeks simply don't buy it. And why did Perrier, a mineral water from France, why did Perrier take America by storm while other imported mineral waters didn't? In short, success in the food export industry is probably a combination of the real taste, the flavor of the product, with some adaptation for the local markets, the satisfaction of certain expectations for the preparation and packaging, and the taste for the product created by images in the global marketing plan. Add to this mix the potential for a short shelf life or even perishable products, and, well, you have a very challenging problem for the multinational food industry.
What is the discussion mainly about? How does the professor organize the lecture? What technique does the professor use to encourage student discussion? What did Ted Levitt mean by the pluralization of consumption? What does the professor say about television and movie companies?
Questions 26 to 30.
Listen to part of a lecture in a sociology class.
First, you have some time to look at questions 26 to 30.
Social influence involves the changes in behavior influenced by the actions of other people. Social influence can come about for a variety of reasons, on a continuum from mere suggestion to, in the more severe form, well, to torture. How does social influence work? Well, first, we must become aware of a difference between ourselves and the values or behaviors of other people. There are a great many studies of social influence that demonstrate how the presence of others can cause us to change our attitudes or actions. Studies show that people eat more when dining with others than, I'm talking about dining out here, so they eat more in the company of others than they do when they're alone. They also run faster when others are running with them. There's even some interesting research on social influence among animals with similar results to those of human studies. Probably one of the most interesting aspects of social influence is the pressure for conformity. Conformity is a process by which an individual's opinion or behavior moves toward the norms of the group. In a classic study by Solomon Asch, 7 people were shown cards with 3 lines drawn on them. Here's an example. So, they were shown the lines, and then they were asked to select the line among the 3 that matched the standard line. Here's the standard. So, there's no question as to the comparison. This has to be easy, right? Wrong. You see, Asch enlisted the cooperation of 6 of the 7 participants in the experiment. On the first card, the 6 respond correctly. They identify the lines of the same length. So the 7th person, who is the only real subject in the experiment, well, the 7th person answers correctly, in agreement with the others. But on the next card, 4 of the cooperating participants choose an incorrect answer, but they're in agreement. So the problem for the subject is whether to conform to the opinion of the peer group, even though the answer is in conflict with the answer that the subject knows to be correct. So, what do you think happened? Well, subjects who were tested alone made errors in answers fewer than 1% of the time. This was the control group. But of those tested in groups of 7, 75% yielded at least once to conform to a group answer that was clearly incorrect. And, on average, subjects conformed to the group in about 37% of the critical trials. This means that they were bringing their behavior into agreement with group norms, in spite of what they were seeing. Later, Asch manipulated the size of the the experimental group, to see whether group size would affect pressure, and it did. But probably less than you might expect. Groups of 4 demonstrated about the same results as groups of 8. Interestingly enough, a unanimous agreement by the group was more important than the number. In other words, a unanimous opinion by 3 exerted more pressure to conform than a majority of 7 with a dissenting opinion in a group of 8. Similar experiments have been performed in various countries among diverse cultural groups with comparable results. Of course, people in cultures that emphasize group cooperation tended to be more willing to conform. But remember that many of the original studies were done in the United States, where there's a high value placed on individualism. In an interesting variation on the study, Abrams found that conformity is especially strong when the group is selected from among those people that the subject clearly identifies with, either because they have characteristics in common or they know each other and interact in a peer group outside of the experimental situation. So what does all of this mean in the real world? Well, since group members can influence one another to conform to the opinion of the group decisions of a group may be called into question. What about decisions by political committees or parliaments? What about juries who are charged with convicting or acquitting an accused defendant? Clearly, social influence will play a part in these critical group decisions. Also interesting is the fact that after a decision is made by a group, there's a tendency to solidify. And by that I mean that the group becomes even more convinced of the validity of the group opinion. This may happen because individual group members who strongly support the group tend to be more popular with the group members.
What is the main topic of the lecture? According to the professor, what two results were reported in the Ash and Abrams studies? Listen again to part of the lecture and then answer the following question.
Later, Ash manipulated the size of the control group. The experimental group, to see whether group size would affect pressure, and it did. But probably less than you might expect.
Why does the professor say this?
The experimental group.
What generally happens after a group makes a decision? What is the professor's attitude about the studies on social influence?
Questions 31 to 35.
Listen to part of a lecture in an anthropology class.
First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 35.
The concepts of power and authority are related, but they're not the same. Power is the ability to exercise influence and control over others, and this can be observed on every level of society, from, the relationships within a family to the relationships among nations. Power is usually structured by customs and social institutions or laws, and tends to be exerted by persuasive arguments or coercion or even brute force. In general, groups with the greatest resources tend to have the advantage in power struggles. So, is power always legitimate? Is it viewed by members of society as justified? Well, no. Power can be realized by individuals or groups, even when it involves the resistance of others, as long as they're in a position to impose their will. But what about power that's accepted by members of society as right and just, that is, legitimate power? Now we're talking about authority, and that's what I want to focus on today. Okay. When individuals or institutions possess authority, they have a recognized and established right to determine policies with the acceptance of those over whom they exercise control. Max Weber, the German classical sociologist, proposed 3 types of authority in society: traditional, charismatic, and rational or legal authority. In all 3 types, he He acknowledged the right of those in positions of power to lead, with the consent of the governed. So, how did Weber differentiate among the three types of authority? Well, he divided them according to how the right to lead and the duty to follow are interpreted. In traditional authority, power resides in customs and conventions that provide certain people or groups with legitimate power in their societies, often their origins found in sacred traditions. The example that most often comes to mind is a monarchy in which kings or queens rule by birthright, not because of any particular quality of leadership or political election, just because they have a claim to authority based on traditional acceptance of their position, and in some cases their unique relationship with and responsibility in religious practices. The royal families in Europe or the emperors in Asia come to mind as examples of traditional authority. Okay, this contrasts sharply with charismatic authority, which is derived because of personal attributes that inspire admiration, loyalty, and even devotion. Leaders who exercise this type of authority may be the founders of religious movements or political parties, but it's not their traditional right to lead. What's important here is that their followers are mobilized more by the force of the leader's personality than by the tradition or the law. So, when we think of charismatic leaders in the United States, perhaps John Kennedy would be an example, because he was able to project a youthful and energetic image that people were proud to identify with. Or, if you prefer Republicans, you may argue that Ronald Reagan was able to exercise authority by virtue of his charismatic appeal. In any case, going back to Weber, to qualify for charismatic authority, a leader must be able to enlist others in the service of a cause that transforms the social structure in some way, which leaves us with legal rational authority, or power that's legitimized by rules, laws, and procedures. In such a system, leaders gain authority not by traditional birthrights or by charismatic appeal, but rather because they're elected or appointed in accordance with the law. And power is delegated to layers of officials who owe their allegiance to the principles that are agreed upon rationally, and because they accept the ideal that the law's supreme. In a legal, rational society, people accept the legitimacy of authority as a government of laws, not of leaders. So, an example of this type of authority might be a president, like Richard Nixon, who was threatened with impeachment because he was perceived as not governing within the law. Some sociologists have postulated that the three types of authority represent stages of evolution in society, that pre-industrial societies tend to respect traditional authority. But as societies move into an industrial age, the importance of tradition wanes in favor of charismatic authority, with a natural rise of charismatic leaders. Then, as the modern era evolves, the rational legal authority embodied by rules and regulations replaces the loyalty to leaders in favor of a respect for law. Of course, other sociologists argue that in practice, authority may be represented by a combination of several of these ideal types at any one time.
What is the main purpose of this lecture? Why does the professor mention Kennedy and Reagan? Listen again to part of the lecture, and then answer the following question.
But what about power that's accepted by members of society as right and just, that is, legitimate power? Now we're talking about authority. And that's what I want to focus on today.
Why does the professor say this?
But what about power that's accepted by members of society as right and just, that is, legitimate power?
In an evolutionary model, how is rational legal authority viewed? What does the professor imply about the three types of authority?
That is the end of Part 3. Now, you will have 7 minutes to transfer your answers to an answer sheet.